Welcome to Cat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello, I'm Kat. Today, we're continuing the Illinois Unsolved series with a case that's still unfolding in real time. So I have a story you may have seen recently on the news or online. It literally just happened within the last couple of weeks or so and is local to me. So I have been keeping a very close eye on it. When I say close to home, I'm able to see people posting about it on Facebook, seeing what locals are saying about the case and the murmurs going around the small town of Mattoon. However, I got a hold of court documents that were released yesterday. So today we are talking about the Lake Mattoon murder case. Let's get into it. June 28th, 2026. For most people spending a summer afternoon on Lake Mattoon, the day looked completely ordinary. Boats drifted across the water, families fished from the shoreline. Others enjoyed one of Central Illinois' most popular recreation lakes. Unaware that beneath the calm surface, investigators would soon uncover one of the most disturbing crime scenes the state has seen in several years. It began with something floating in the water. From a distance, it didn't seem unusual. One group of recreational boaters noticed what they assumed was a dead fish. As they moved closer, though, something didn't look right. What they were looking at wasn't a fish at all. It was a human arm. Within minutes, calls were placed to authorities. The Cumberland County Sheriff's Office responded first, before requesting assistance from the Illinois State Police Division of Criminal Investigation. Very quickly, what had begun as a suspicious death investigation would evolve into a case spanning hundreds of miles, from the quiet waters of Lake Mattoon to a suburban home nearly 3 hours away in Plainfield, Illinois. At that moment, investigators had almost nothing to work with. No missing persons report connected to the remains. No witnesses who knew how the arm ended up in the lake. No obvious crime scene. Just a single, horrifying discovery. But over the next several days, investigators would recover far more than that first arm. According to court records, search teams used sonar equipment to begin searching the lake. Divers and recovery crews slowly worked through the area where the arm had been found. Then the discoveries continued. Black plastic trash bags began surfacing from the water. Inside those bags were additional human remains. Investigators also found 5-pound exercise weights, concrete, duct tape, and clear packing tape. According to prosecutors, the remains had been cut into numerous pieces before being placed into the bags and submerged in the lake. The crime scene immediately raised more questions than answers. Who was this person? Why had someone gone to such extraordinary lengths to conceal the body? And perhaps, most importantly, where had this killing actually happened? Because there was one thing investigators quickly realized. Whoever left these remains in Lake Mattoon likely hadn't committed the crime there. This looked like a body disposal site, which meant somewhere else there was almost certainly a primary crime scene waiting to be discovered. Before investigators could answer any of those questions, they needed to know one thing: who was in that lake? The recovered remains offered very few immediate clues. But several tattoos had survived. Investigators carefully documented each one. One depicted a skeleton wearing or holding a Green Bay Packers helmet. Another featured the classic Laugh Now, Cry Later theater masks. There was also a Chicago Bears-themed tattoo, lettering across part of the arm, and several additional identifying markings. The victim was also wearing multiple rings. One immediately stood out. Engraved across it was a single word: Dale W. Robin. At the time, investigators had no way of knowing whether that ring represented two people, a nickname, or perhaps something far more significant. But they knew someone somewhere would likely recognize those tattoos. So Illinois State Police made an unusual decision. Rather than releasing a photograph of the victim, investigators publicly released photographs of the tattoos themselves. They hoped someone scrolling through Facebook or watching the evening news would recognize the artwork, and somebody did. According to the court filings, investigators compared one of the released tattoos with publicly available Facebook photographs, and the images matched. One thing that often surprises people is that investigators don't always identify someone through fingerprints or DNA. In many cases, tattoos, jewelry, scars, and even social media photos become the first breakthrough. In this case, investigators compared the tattoo recovered from the remains with publicly available Facebook photos. The victim was identified as 38-year-old Dalewayne Turner of Plainfield, Illinois. For Dalewayne's family, the confirmation was devastating. His family wants him to be remembered for who he was: fun, outgoing, and always there for his family members. What had started as a mystery playing out on the evening news had suddenly become deeply personal for them. But for investigators, the identification changed everything. Because once they knew who Dalewayne was, they could begin asking an entirely different set of questions. Where had he last been seen? Who lived with him? Who spoke to him last? Who had reasons to want him dead? And perhaps most importantly, how had a man from Plainfield, nearly 180 miles from Lake Mattoon, end up dismembered and submerged in the central Illinois lake? Those answers would eventually lead investigators to a quiet neighborhood in Plainfield, a maroon Dodge Ram pickup, a basement freezer, and court documents alleging a chain of events that is almost difficult to comprehend. But at this point in the investigation, none of that had been discovered yet. All investigators had was a name, and the clock was ticking. The identification of Dalewayne Turner gave investigators their first real lead, but it also opened the door to an even larger mystery. Who was Dalewayne? Who was waiting for him back in Plainfield? And why would someone allegedly transport human remains nearly 3 hours before leaving them beneath the waters of Lake Mattoon? Those answers would begin with the people who knew him best. By the time Illinois State Police publicly identified the victim, investigators had already begun shifting their focus away from Lake Mattoon. The lake was no longer the mystery. The mystery had become Dalewayne Turner himself. Dalewayne Turner was 38 years old and lived in Plainfield, Illinois, a growing suburb about 40 miles southwest of downtown Chicago. On paper, there was nothing to immediately suggest that his life would become the center of one of Illinois' most disturbing homicide investigations. According to court records, Dalewayne lived on Ruth Fitzgerald Drive with his wife, Robin Turner, and his half-brother, James Adams. That address would soon become one of the most important locations in the investigation. But investigators didn't know that yet. At first, they simply began doing what detectives always do after identifying a victim. They started reconstructing the last days of his life. They looked for missing persons reports. They searched for recent police calls, and they interviewed family members. They identified everyone living inside the home. And almost immediately, investigators noticed something unusual. Despite Dalewayne's remains being discovered nearly 180 miles away in Lake Mattoon, no one had officially reported him missing. That doesn't automatically indicate foul play. Adults disappear voluntarily every day. Sometimes families assume someone is staying with friends. Sometimes people intentionally disconnect from those around them. But when detectives are investigating a suspicious death, the absence of a missing person report often becomes an important piece of that timeline. If no one is looking for someone, why? Investigators also began learning about the people closest to Dalewayne. His wife, Robin Turner, was 62. His half-brother, James Adams, who's 26, and another brother, Stephen Turner. At this point, all three were simply people detectives needed to speak with. There was no public indication that investigators considered any of them suspects. As detectives worked to reconstruct Dalewayne's final days, they also examined publicly available information. One of the biggest breakthroughs came from something many of us post online without much thought: Facebook. According to court records, investigators compared the distinctive tattoos found on the recovered remains with photographs from Dalewayne's Facebook. One tattoo in particular, the classic Laugh Now, Cry Later theater masks, matched perfectly. Now detectives had family members, vehicles associated with the residents, phones to locate, financial records to review, security cameras to obtain, license plate readers to analyze, and a timeline to build. The next question is almost always, what happened during their final days? As detectives interviewed people connected to Dalewayne, one story quickly emerged. According to Robin Turner, his wife, the last time she believed she saw Dalewayne was on June 21st, 2026. She told investigators that morning had started with an argument. She said Dalewayne and James, his half-brother, had gotten into a disagreement over sports cards. Robin told investigators she then left the house to visit her mother, who lived in a memory care facility. While she was away, she said James called her. According to Robin, James told her Dalewayne was upset and planned to leave. Robin said she then called Dalewayne herself. She claimed Dalewayne told her he was unhappy and intended to stay with a friend in Kankakee. On the surface, it sounds plausible. Family arguments happen, people cool off, people stay with friends, especially considering the three of them lived together, so to cool off, he would need to go somewhere else. Nothing about that explanation by itself necessarily suggested a crime had occurred. Robin told investigators that when she returned home, Dalewayne was gone. She also mentioned something she didn't initially think much about. She noticed a faint smell of bleach inside the home. She believed James had simply washed the floors. Again, on its own, that detail might not have seemed significant. But investigators weren't looking at a single detail. They were looking at hundreds. Each interview, each phone call, each receipt, each search history, each piece of physical evidence. They would eventually paint a picture prosecutors now allege shows a deliberate effort to conceal a homicide. But investigators weren't there yet. They still had far more questions than answers. Did Dalewayne actually leave for Kankakee? Who was the friend he supposedly planned to stay with? Had anyone spoken to him after June 21st when his wife alleges she spoke to him? Had anyone seen him, used his phone, his credit cards, his vehicle? Every answer would either strengthen or weaken the timeline investigators were beginning to build. Meanwhile, nearly 3 hours away, the recovery operation at Lake Mattoon continued. Additional remains had been recovered. Detectives now knew whose body they belonged to, but they still didn't know exactly where he had been killed or who was responsible. That would begin to change because of something no detective can ever predict. A conversation inside a suburban home. A conversation that one family member simply couldn't keep to himself. And one phone call to 911 that would change the entire direction of the investigation. For nearly 2 days after Dalewayne's identification, investigators continued piecing together his final movements. Then, on the evening of June 30th, a man named Stephen Turner walked out of the Plainfield home, dialed 911, and told dispatchers something almost unimaginable. According to investigators, his own family had just confessed to killing Dalewayne. And if you remember, Stephen Turner is Dalewayne's other brother. By the end of June, investigators had made significant progress. They knew the victim's identity, they knew he lived in Plainfield, and they had begun reconstructing his final days. But despite all of that, they still didn't know where Dalewayne Turner had been killed. Lake Mattoon didn't appear to be the primary crime scene. Investigators believed someone had transported his remains after his death. What they needed now was a break. And according to court records, that break came on the evening of June 30th, 2026. Ironically, it didn't come from sophisticated forensic testing. It didn't come from DNA. It didn't come from surveillance cameras, but it came from a member of Dalewayne's own family, Stephen Turner. According to investigators, Stephen had recently moved into the home on Ruth Fitzgerald Drive in Plainfield, where Dalewayne, Robin, and James all lived together. That evening started out like any other. Stephen, Robin, and James drove to Indiana to buy fireworks. Court documents allege James was driving, Stephen sat in the front passenger seat, Robin rode in the back seat. According to Stephen's interview, Robin spent approximately $500 on fireworks before the group headed back toward Plainfield. Nothing about the trip appeared unusual. They even stopped at a KFC drive-thru near their house before returning home. If you had driven past them that evening, you never would have guessed investigators were already trying to determine what had happened to Dalewayne Turner. Back at the house, the three settled into what sounded like an ordinary evening. They turned on the television. The show they were watching was Landman, the Paramount Plus drama starring Billy Bob Thornton. It's such an oddly specific detail that it almost sounds fictional. But details like this are often what make witness statements believable. People rarely remember exact times, and they don't often remember precise conversations. But they remember where they were, what they were watching, what they were eating. These ordinary details become anchors in memory. Stephen later told investigators they had been watching the show when James suddenly paused it. Then James said something that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. According to Stephen, James told him, "I have something I need to tell you." At that moment, Stephen had no idea that the conversation was about to place him in the center of a homicide investigation. According to court documents, James and Robin began telling Stephen about events they claimed had happened roughly 9 days earlier. They described an argument involving Dalewayne. According to Stephen's account, they said the confrontation became physical. James allegedly admitted grabbing a knife. He allegedly said he stabbed Dalewayne multiple times. And according to the court filings, James and Robin told Stephen that Dalewayne bled out and died inside that home. Then came the part Stephen later told investigators he struggled to process. According to Stephen, James and Robin said they had dismembered Dalewayne's body. They allegedly told him portions of the remains had been placed into a freezer in their basement. Other body parts, they claimed, had been taken to a lake and disposed of there. Imagine hearing that. You're sitting on a couch, watching TV, when two members of your own family suddenly begin describing what prosecutors now allege was the killing and dismemberment of your brother. Stephen also told investigators that James and Robin said it had taken approximately 4 hours to clean blood from the house after Dalewayne's death. Investigators would later compare that statement with what they found inside the residence. According to the filings, Stephen said he personally had not noticed obvious bloodstains around the house. He also said he had not observed any injuries on Robin. He did remember seeing a bruise on James's arm. When he asked about it, James allegedly told him it happened after falling down the stairs. At the time, so this would have been what I said, 10 days prior to them telling him. So at the time, Stephen had no way of knowing whether anything he had just been told was true. Maybe it was some bizarre joke. Maybe James was exaggerating. Maybe there was another explanation. But according to investigators, Stephen wasn't willing to take that chance. Thank God. He hugged James, walked out of the house, and called 911. That decision may have changed the course of the entire investigation. At approximately 9:03 p.m., Joliet police notified Illinois State Police that Stephen Turner had reported an extraordinary allegation. According to dispatch information summarized in the court filings, Stephen told authorities that Robin Turner and James Adams had confessed to killing Dalewayne Turner. He also reported something even more alarming. He said they told him Dalewayne's body was still inside the basement freezer. By coincidence, or perhaps by timing investigators would later consider fortunate, members of the Illinois State Police Major Case Assistance Team, known as J-Mans, were already in the area conducting surveillance connected to the investigation. When they learned Stephen had left the residence on foot, they located him nearby. Investigators made contact. Stephen agreed to accompany them to Illinois State Police headquarters in Lockport. While Stephen was being interviewed, the investigators accelerated dramatically. According to court records, investigators learned James and Robin had begun driving around the neighborhood looking for Stephen. They were allegedly calling his phone repeatedly. If true, investigators now had 2 people who had allegedly confessed to a homicide searching for the person who had just reported them to the police. J-Mans made the decision to intervene. Officers stopped the maroon Dodge Ram. James Adams and Robin Turner were detained, and the truck was seized. And this is probably for the best to make sure Stephen stayed safe, because who's to say they wouldn't do something about that? Especially if they think that he had said something to the police or they were worried he was going to say something. Investigators began preparing what would become one of the most significant search warrants in the entire case. Because if Stephen was telling the truth, then inside the house on Ruth Fitzgerald Drive, investigators were about to encounter a crime scene unlike anything they had expected when a single human arm surfaced in Lake Mattoon just days earlier. At this point, investigators had a witness. They had a growing collection of evidence. Cell phone searches, text messages, surveillance cameras, a home they urgently needed to search, and a timeline that prosecutors now allege showed the cover-up had begun long before anyone discovered Dalewayne Turner's remains in Lake Mattoon. Investigators started to piece together more about the case. Not just of where people went, but of what they searched, what they bought, what they texted, and what allegedly changed inside the house after June 21st. According to prosecutors, those individual pieces would eventually become one of the strongest parts of their case. Because unlike eyewitness testimony, digital evidence doesn't rely on memory. Search histories are time-stamped, text messages are preserved, store receipts record purchases down to the minute. Together, prosecutors allege they tell the story of an attempted cover-up. License plate reader cameras capture vehicles automatically. But to understand why investigators believe that, we have to go back several weeks before Dalewayne's death. According to investigators, they recovered Robin Turner's Google search history from her phone after obtaining a search warrant. What they found immediately caught investigators' attention. The search begins on June 2nd. Remember, she said the last day he was seen was June 21st, so this is almost 20 days before. More than 2 weeks before Dalewayne was allegedly killed. According to the court filings, Robin searched. I'm going to read out all of these things she searched. Does chloroform really knock you out? And then just 6 days later, on June 8th, investigators say she searched, can you die from an overdose of lithium? Followed by, can you die from an overdose of Adderall? On June 14th, she searched, can you commit suicide with sleeping pills? And then on June 16th, how much Tide Pod can make someone sick? By themselves, internet searches don't necessarily prove a crime. People search strange things every day. I mean, don't go looking in my search history, especially with doing this podcast. Curiosity alone isn't evidence of murder. But prosecutors allege the pattern became more significant as the dates moved closer to June 21st. On June 18th, 3 days before the killing, Robin allegedly searched, what does an overdose of Adderall look like? Then, is it easy to crack your head from a fall? Another search asked, can Adderall make you lightheaded? And finally, one search stood out because of what investigators would later discover inside the Plainfield home. The search simply read, chest freezer. According to Robin, she purchased a new freezer from Best Buy on June 19th, explaining that the previous freezer had stopped working. That purchase by itself is not illegal or even necessarily suspicious. But prosecutors point to its timing in relation to later events as part of the overall timeline they allege shows planning and concealment. So we're going to move to the day of June 21st. According to Robin's interview with investigators, the morning began with a disagreement. She said James Adams and Dalewayne Turner argued over sports cards. I assume that means like baseball cards, that sort of thing. Robin then left the home to visit her mother at a memory care facility. While she was gone, she said James called her. He allegedly told her Dalewayne was upset and planned to leave. Robin then called Dalewayne herself. She told investigators Dalewayne said he intended to stay with a friend in Kankakee. When she returned home, she said Dalewayne was gone. She also noticed something she initially described as unusual. It was a faint smell of bleach. She believed James had simply washed the floors, like I said earlier. At the time, she said she didn't think much of it. Investigators, however, would later compare that statement with everything else they uncovered. And then we get to the text messages. According to prosecutors, June 22nd became one of the most revealing days in the digital evidence. Investigators recovered text conversations between Robin and James sent that morning. The messages discussed practical problems: finding a dolly, buying carpet cleaner, going to Home Depot, possibly needing a hoist. One message allegedly referenced continuing to pour bleach if something started to smell. Another message discussed deleting communications. According to the filing, one text read, "Be sure to fully delete everything." And again, a single message doesn't tell the whole story. People delete texts for countless reasons, but prosecutors argue these messages cannot be viewed in isolation. Instead, the text should be considered alongside what happened next. Robin acknowledged to investigators that a surprising number of projects were completed around the home during the days following June 21st, a little home renovation. According to her own statement, the stairway was repainted, wood paneling was removed from the staircase, those panels were later burned in the backyard fire pit, the front door was repainted, the ceramic tile landing near the front entrance was repainted or altered, the living room rug was replaced with 2 new rugs. Each project might sound ordinary on its own. Many homeowners repaint, replace flooring, burn wood, but prosecutors allege these renovations were not routine home improvements. They argue they were part of an effort to remove or conceal evidence from inside the residence. Whether that allegation ultimately holds up in the court will be decided at trial, but it became a major focus of the investigation. Then came another purchase. Investigators reviewed surveillance video from a Menards in Crest Hill. According to the court filing, the footage showed James Adams and Robin Turner arriving together on June 23rd, so 2 days after the last day he was seen. They allegedly purchased approximately 20 bags of concrete, along with other miscellaneous items. Later that same afternoon, license plate reader cameras captured the maroon Dodge Ram traveling through Joliet. Visible in the truck bed, investigators say appeared to be those same bags of concrete. At this point, detectives still didn't know exactly where the investigation would lead, but they were documenting everything. Meanwhile, as they run these errands and continue doing home renovations, Robin's alleged search history continued. On June 24th, she searched, "How long does it take a fresh 26-pound turkey to freeze?" which is just kind of horrifying, knowing that turkey probably wasn't the thing she was actually searching for. Then, why are there so many missing people that never get found? And perhaps the most haunting search of all, how do you divorce someone you can't find? The following day, investigators say Robin searched concrete mixer, and then can spoiled meat stink if frozen? And finally, do you have to have a body embalmed? Again, these are allegations contained in the court filings. Prosecutors argue they become significant when viewed alongside all of the other evidence that they are uncovering. By now, investigators weren't looking at isolated facts. They were assembling a pretty good timeline with the searches, the texts, the purchases, the home renovations, the new freezer a couple days earlier. Each item was entered into the chronology. Still, there was one major question investigators couldn't answer yet. If Dalewayne had been killed inside the Plainfield home, why did part of his body end up nearly 180 miles away in Lake Mattoon? The answer, prosecutors allege, would come from something that most drivers never even notice: automatic license plate reader cameras. And those cameras would document a road trip that investigators now believe connected the Plainfield house to the discovery at Lake Mattoon. According to prosecutors, the most important witness in this part of the investigation wasn't a person at all. It was a network of cameras, placed silently along highways and intersections across Illinois. Those cameras would capture a maroon Dodge Ram, a pair of gray storage totes, and a journey south that investigators now allege ended at the waters of Lake Mattoon. I would just like to interject too, I've seen a lot of speculation online of how some of the remains ended up in Lake Mattoon. I've seen some crazy stuff like, oh, maybe it blew from the house into the lake with the tornadoes. There have been a lot of bad tornadoes in central Illinois, things like that. But this timeline, I feel like really, the evidence here really rules all of those things out. By the end of June, Illinois State Police had accumulated an extraordinary amount of information. From interviews, search histories, texts, receipts, statements from family members. But one question still loomed over the investigation. If prosecutors were correct, and if Dalewayne Turner had died inside the home in Plainfield, then someone still had to move those remains. And that meant there had to be a route. A vehicle, a destination, probably not a tornado. Investigators believed that route existed. They just had to find it. Fortunately, modern investigations often leave behind silent witnesses. Not people, technology. Every day, thousands of vehicles travel Illinois highways without their drivers giving much thought to the cameras mounted above intersections and along roadways. Most motorists never notice them. They are license plate reader cameras, often called LPRs. Their primary purpose is simple: capture license plates, record the exact data, the exact time, the exact location, sometimes even a clear image of the vehicle itself. Those cameras don't forget, they don't confuse dates, and according to prosecutors, they became one of the most important witnesses in this entire investigation. So investigators began reviewing license plate reader hits connected to a maroon Dodge Ram registered to James Adams and Robin Turner. One image after another. A timeline began taking shape. The first significant image investigators describe came on June 23rd, just days after prosecutors allege Dalewayne was killed. At approximately 4:10 p.m., a license plate reader captured the Dodge Ram traveling through Joliet. Visible in the truck bed, investigators believed they could see bags of concrete. That detail immediately stood out, because surveillance footage from Menards had already shown James and Robin allegedly purchasing approximately 20 bags of concrete earlier that afternoon. The purchases and the cameras matched. It was another piece fitting neatly into the growing timeline. Still, concrete alone didn't explain Lake Mattoon. That connection wouldn't come for 3 days. On June 26th, the first camera that morning captured the truck in Joliet at approximately 9:27 a.m. Nothing unusual appeared in the truck bed. No totes, no obvious cargo, just the maroon Dodge Ram. Hours passed. Then, nearly 100 miles south, another camera captured the same truck. This time, the image looked different. At approximately 7:18 p.m., a license plate reader in Mahomet, Illinois, photographed the Dodge Ram. According to investigators, 2 gray plastic storage totes were now sitting in the bed of the truck. The totes appeared to be wrapped with duct tape, and that observation immediately became important, because investigators had already begun finding duct tape associated with the recovered remains. So these are happening simultaneously. At that moment, though, the totes were still inside the truck. The journey continued. And then less than an hour later, another camera at approximately 8:05 p.m., the truck entered Mattoon. And something had changed. According to investigators, the gray totes were gone. The truck bed appeared empty. No storage containers, no duct tape totes, nothing. That image immediately raised a question investigators could not ignore. What happened between Mahomet and Mattoon? The distance between those two communities is roughly 70 miles. Somewhere during that drive, according to prosecutors, the truck lost its cargo. The night wasn't over, though. Just 2 hours later, another license plate reader captured the same Dodge Ram. This time, it was near Effingham, which is further south, so it's approximately 28 miles south of Mattoon, so they're continuing south. Again, investigators noted nothing visible in the truck bed. Whatever had been there earlier was gone. To detectives, the sequence became increasingly significant. Joliet, Mahomet, Mattoon, Effingham. Each camera formed what prosecutors now argue is a travel timeline leading directly through the area where human remains would later be recovered. Investigators weren't finished, though, because after reviewing the license plate reader data, one stop quickly caught their attention, and it was a Walmart in Effingham, so that stop that was even further south than Mattoon. Security footage allegedly showed James Adams entering the store later that evening. What happened next struck investigators as unusual. According to court records, James purchased a change of clothes, a white t-shirt, red, white, and blue shorts. Then he walked into the men's restroom. A short time later, he exited wearing the new clothes. His previous clothing had disappeared. Investigators later learned Walmart employees emptied restroom trash into the store dumpster. Officers searched that dumpster, and according to prosecutors, they recovered the clothes James had discarded there. Throwing away old clothes is not a crime. But the alleged clothing change occurred only hours after the Dodge Ram had traveled through Mattoon. Only hours after investigators believe the gray totes disappeared from the truck. Another event added to the growing timeline. Then, the investigation produced another unexpected break. On June 30th, a Mattoon area resident contacted Illinois State Police. She reported seeing 2 gray plastic storage totes abandoned in an overgrown ditch near her property. Investigators responded. The location immediately caught their attention. The totes were found approximately 0.7 of a mile west of where human remains had been recovered from Lake Mattoon. So very close. According to the court filings, investigators recovered 2 gray totes, 2 matching lids, and duct tape still attached to them. To detectives, they looked remarkably similar to the same gray totes visible in the Mahomet license plate reader photograph. Investigators had now connected surveillance cameras, recovered physical evidence, and the Lake Mattoon recovery site. And the picture was becoming clearer, not because of a single witness or one confession, but because of dozens of independent pieces of evidence appeared to be pointing investigators toward the same conclusion. By this point, the route from Plainfield to central Illinois was no longer just an idea. It was becoming something prosecutors believed they could demonstrate using receipts. Cameras, recovered evidence, and digital records. Still, one question remained. If Dalewayne Turner had never truly left the house alive, would investigators find proof inside the residence itself? They were about to find out. Because on July 1st, armed with search warrants, investigators walked through the front door of the home on Ruth Fitzgerald Drive. And according to court filings, what they found inside was even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. One of the mysteries investigators still haven't answered is why Lake Mattoon was chosen. It's nearly 180 miles from Plainfield. Whether there was a personal connection to the area, or whether investigators believe it was selected simply because of its distance, has not yet been publicly explained. So by the morning of July 1st, investigators had spent days assembling what they believed was a compelling timeline. The investigators had a lot of circumstantial evidence, even a family member reporting that James and Robin allegedly confessed to killing Dalewayne. But investigators still needed one thing: physical evidence. Without it, the case remained largely circumstantial. If Stephen Turner's account was accurate, then the answers investigators were looking for weren't in Lake Mattoon anymore. They were nearly 200 miles north, inside that house on Ruth Fitzgerald Drive. At approximately 1:13 on July 1st, investigators obtained a search warrant for 2 locations. The first was the home. The second was the maroon Dodge Ram pickup that investigators had spent days tracking through surveillance footage. Before entering the home, Illinois State Police crime scene investigators began processing the truck. Inside, investigators recovered 2 cell phones. One was identified as belonging to James Adams. The second phone would later become much more significant. According to court documents, investigators determined it belonged to Dalewayne Turner. Even though Dalewayne himself had been missing for days, his phone had allegedly remained with the truck. Another piece of the timeline, another unanswered question. Later that afternoon, investigators did enter the Plainfield home. On the surface, nothing immediately suggested the scene prosecutors now allege unfolded there. It looked ordinary, a quiet suburban neighborhood, a family home. But investigators weren't looking at the home the way most people would. They were looking for subtle changes, fresh paint, replaced flooring, signs that parts of the house had been altered. And according to the filings, they found exactly that. As we talked about earlier, freshly painted walls, painted stairways, painted front door, new carpeting, evidence that wood paneling had been removed. Earlier interviews had already indicated that some remodeling occurred after June 21st. Now, investigators were seeing those changes for themselves. Then the investigators moved downstairs. According to the court filings, they located a freezer. It wasn't sitting out in the open. The freezer had been locked shut, and it had been wrapped with duct tape. A blanket had been draped over it, and cinder blocks had been placed on top. So a lot of unusual things with the way this freezer was in the basement. Investigators immediately recognized that the freezer would need to be processed carefully. Before opening it, they documented everything. And one detail immediately caught their attention. Lying beneath the blanket was a reciprocating saw blade. According to investigators, the blade appeared to have a blood-like substance on it. Nearby, they located packaging for that saw, but the saw itself was missing. Investigators also observed what they described as red, blood-like stains near the freezer's drain opening. At this point, they still hadn't even opened it. Everything they had seen so far felt like it had led them to this single moment. Crime scene investigators carefully opened the freezer. Inside, according to the filings, they found human remains. Specifically, investigators documented the victim's torso, neck, and head. The limbs were absent. Those investigators believed had been transported elsewhere. For detectives, the discovery fundamentally changed the case. No longer were they simply investigating remains found in Lake Mattoon. They had now located what prosecutors allege was the primary crime scene. The victim was identified as Dalewayne Turner in the freezer, the same man whose tattoos had helped investigators identify the remains recovered from the lake only days earlier. The pieces of the investigation were finally beginning to connect. As investigators continued processing the residence, additional evidence was documented. According to the court filings, they observed red blood-like stains in multiple areas of the home, and they photographed all the freshly painted surfaces, the replaced flooring, every room, every hallway. Each piece was carefully documented. Because investigators understood something important, the story they would eventually present in court wouldn't rely on a single dramatic discovery. It would rely on hundreds of small observations. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the evidence recovered from the truck. One of the phones found during the search warrant was identified as Dalewayne Turner's. Court documents state investigators confirmed the phone number associated with it and noted that the device itself was labeled Dale. Search warrants were later obtained to examine the phones and recover digital evidence. You really have to think about how much this investigation changed in only a few short days. This is so much evidence in such a short amount of time. It started with that single human arm floating in Lake Mattoon. They didn't know the victim. They didn't know where the crime had occurred. They didn't know whether it was an accident, a homicide, or something else entirely. Now, according to prosecutors, they had all of it: a victim, a suspected crime scene, witness statements, digital evidence, surveillance footage, and physical evidence recovered from the residence. And allegations that 2 members of the victim's own household had attempted to conceal what happened. But despite everything, many of the biggest questions still remained unanswered. What exactly happened inside that house on June 21st? What was the motive? Was this truly self-defense, as James Adams claimed in his spontaneous statement? Or would prosecutors ultimately argue something very different? Those questions have not been answered yet. And at this stage in the investigation, neither investigators nor the public knew how this case would ultimately unfold in court. By early July, the investigation that began with the horrifying discovery in Lake Mattoon had expanded into a multi-agency homicide investigation stretching nearly 200 miles across Illinois. Investigators had recovered human remains from the lake. They had identified the victim as Dalewayne Turner. They had traced the investigation back to the home in Plainfield. And after executing search warrants and interviewing witnesses, prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to begin filing criminal charges. But interestingly, the first charges filed were not murder. Instead, prosecutors charged James Adams and Robin Turner with dismembering a human body and concealment of a homicidal death. For many people following the case, that immediately raised questions. If prosecutors believed Dalewayne was killed, why weren't homicide charges filed immediately? The answer is actually more common than many people realize. Sometimes investigators have enough evidence to prove someone helped conceal a death or illegally dispose of a body before they're ready to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, exactly who caused the death and under what circumstances. Rather than rushing the most serious charge, prosecutors often continue building the homicide cases while moving forward on charges they believe are already supported by the available evidence. That appears to be what may be going on here. Illinois State Police have publicly stated that additional charges are expected, signaling that investigators believe the case is still developing. It's also important to remember something that can easily get lost in a high-profile investigation. Everything we've discussed from the court filings, the Google searches, the text messages, the surveillance footage, Stephen Turner's account, the alleged confession, all of it represents the prosecution's version of events at this stage. James Adams and Robin Turner are presumed innocent unless and until they are proven guilty in court. Their attorneys will have the opportunity to challenge every allegation, every witness, and every piece of forensic evidence, and every interpretation offered by investigators. That's how the criminal justice system is designed to work. Among all of the allegations contained in the detention petitions, one statement continues to stand out. According to investigators, after James Adams invoked his Miranda rights and declined a formal interview, he allegedly made a spontaneous remark. Court records quote him as saying, quote, "The one thing I will say is that I did it, but I did it out of self-defense. I will tell you guys that." Quote. That single sentence raises almost as many questions as it answers. If prosecutors argue this was an intentional homicide, what evidence will they present? If James claims self-defense, what facts will his attorneys rely on? What happened inside that house on June 21st? Those answers have not yet been presented in open court. And until then, the full story remains incomplete. Even after reviewing hundreds of pages of investigative material, several major questions remain unanswered. One of the biggest is motive. Court documents describe an argument, but was that truly enough to trigger the violence prosecutors allege occurred? Also, the fact that there had been searches about different things seemingly related to murder or setting up a staged suicide prior to that argument. Were there other factors investigators have not yet made public? Another unanswered question is the exact sequence of events. According to the detention petitions, investigators believe Dalewayne was stabbed. But how many times? Where exactly? What forensic evidence supports that conclusion? The public doesn't know yet. The medical examiner's complete findings had not yet been included in the documents that were reviewed today. Those findings could become an important part of the future court proceedings. So an autopsy was completed, but it's just not public yet. Will investigators recover DNA from the gray storage totes, the reciprocating saw blade, the truck, the concrete? Will blood pattern analysis inside the home support the prosecution's timeline? And what additional evidence will be recovered from the cell phones? And perhaps one of the biggest unanswered questions of all, will homicide charges eventually be filed? Illinois State Police have already indicated that more charges are expected. Whether those charges include first-degree murder or something else entirely remains to be seen. Behind every court filing, every search warrant, every news headline, there is a family trying to process an unimaginable loss. Dalewayne Turner wasn't simply the victim. He was a husband, a brother, a cousin, a son, someone whose loved ones are now navigating grief while also watching every new court filing become public. His cousin, Crystal Mann, has spoken publicly about the emotional toll the case has taken on the family. She described feeling physically sick after learning the allegations and said she had spoken with Robin Turner shortly before the arrests, believing Dalewayne was still alive. If true, that realization is almost impossible to imagine. As this case moves forward, the Turner family, like so many families affected by violent crime, will likely spend months or even years waiting for answers inside the courtroom. Also, unfortunately, this would not be the first time violent crime has affected this family specifically. Dalewayne Turner's mother, Kendra Turner Adams, so this would be Dalewayne and James's mother, Kendra Turner Adams, was murdered in 2014 by his stepfather, John Adams. And Dalewayne actually had custody of James after their mother was murdered 12 years ago. And this is all according to Crystal, their cousin. So Dalewayne was actually technically James's legal guardian, I guess. Cases like this don't capture public attention simply because they're shocking. They capture attention because they challenge our assumptions. A quiet suburban neighborhood, a family home, a summer afternoon at the lake, nothing about those settings suggest a story like this. Yet, according to prosecutors, those ordinary places become connected by one of the most disturbing criminal investigations Illinois has seen in recent memory. It's a reminder that investigations rarely unfold the way they do on television. They aren't solved by one dramatic clue. They are built piece by piece. A tattoo, a phone search, a text message, a witness willing to call 911. Investigators allege they will reveal a much larger picture. Whether that picture ultimately convinces a jury is a question only time will answer. As of the recording of this episode, James Adams and Robin Turner have been charged with dismembering a human body and concealment of a homicidal death. They have not been convicted of those charges. The investigation remains active. We'll continue following this case as new court filings, forensic evidence, and future hearings provide more answers. Because despite everything investigators have uncovered so far, there are still so many questions that only a courtroom can answer. And until those answers come, the Lake Mattoon investigation remains one of the most significant and still evolving criminal cases in Illinois. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you found this episode informative, I'd really appreciate it if you'd follow the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave a rating or review. If you'd like to share your thoughts on this case or any other case, you can find me on Instagram at Kat Has Questions. As always, stay curious. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.